This thing is sick. You should totally build it. To begin, I started cutting my cabinet panels out of 3/4 inch oak plywood. I'm not going to get too detailed about my measurements on this, but if you make the same cuts that I do, it'll allow you to make it to whatever size fits you best. I roughly ended up with a cabinet that was 60 inches long. You've probably noticed my use of painter's tape to avoid tear out on the saw. It worked pretty good. Here I've stacked the bottom and top panels so that I can line them up and make a mark to cut them to the perfect length. Also repeating this step on the side panels, I made them about 22 inches tall. Once they were all the length that I wanted, I set up a fence on my table saw and I cut them to the depth of about 16.5 inches. I laid out all of my cabinet panels and then I taped where the joints would meet. So later when I glued everything up, they would act almost like a hinge. My footage looks a little weird because of fires that were nearby while I was making this. We almost were evacuated and the smoke looked like this for almost a month. And I pretty much stayed inside after this day right here. I put glue in the seams and then here you can see the hinge method I was talking about. Also, these ratchet straps did pretty good to hold everything together. I know they make some that are specific for this purpose though. Once I was able to work again, I made these blocks to stabilize the joints. I used this Kreg jig to make pocket holes and then I glued them in place. And that rounded up the cabinet part of the build. To begin my drawer boxes, I cut the bottoms out of 1/4 inch plywood. Then I cut the sides out of MDF. After gluing up the joints, I clamped them together and then I pin nailed them. Then it was time to put on the bottom. I glued all around the perimeter and then I put on the 1/4 inch plywood. I pre-drilled holes with a bit that was slightly thinner than my pin nails, just so I wouldn't mess up and go out the side. I ended up having a slight bow in the top panel of the cabinet, so I used some scrap wood to push it to the right distance. Just like the drawers, I used 1/4 inch to make the back bracing. I got some drawer slides and then I marked holes for screws. If you could tell by the look on my face, I'm having so much fun. It's the exact same process with the inner slide. Also, remember when you're measuring for the length of your drawer box that you don't forget that there's a 3/4 inch gap for each block and a 1/2 inch gap for each slide. So you should be taking away about 2.5 inches. Here I'm ripping strips out of a solid oak 1x4. I'm ripping them to about 3/4 inch thick so that they'll match the thickness of the plywood. The strips are going to be the edge banding for the front of the cabinet and frame it in really well. To measure these, I would cut a 45 in one end and then I would make a mark. Then I would shave off a little by little until it fit perfectly into the gap. After that, I would glue and clamp them into place. For my top drawer, I took a 1x piece of poplar and I cut it to 7 inches. Then I used the cutoff and I glued it onto another piece of poplar. That is hard to say. That created a larger panel for my bottom drawer face. While that was drying up, I cut my top drawer face to length. Once it was ready, I sawed up the glued up panel to where it was square, and then I measured and cut it to length. I ended up fixing this splintered off piece here by gluing it back on. Using a jigsaw, I cut out what I'm gonna call handle holes, I guess. You can also use a bandsaw to do this. You just gotta use what you got. And this is my favorite part, sanding. And more sanding. I'm still trying to figure out what I like as far as stains go. I used Minwax on this and it turned out pretty good. There was almost a ripple effect that came out of the veneers when I was staining it, but I was afraid to sand through it. I'm curious anybody who has a solution. Once the stain had dried, I topped it off with Danish oil that had a satin finish. I realized here that when I was cutting my cabinet panels, I didn't match up the grain from the top to the sides. I think they call that character. The drawer faces were primed using a rattle can. And then I sprayed them satin white. Here I drilled holes for the screws that would attach the drawer faces. I used a bit that was thinner than the head of the screw but thicker than the actual threads. When I attached the faces, I left the screws a little loose so that I could line up the gaps using a little card trick. Then, holding everything in line with a clamp through the handle holes, I tightened up the screws. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed building it. If you'd like to see how I made these hairpin legs, I made another video where I show you an extremely simple way. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. I'm Jason, I'll see you later.